Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Global Politics with Dr. Detzi and Dr. Kusluch. I'm Joseph Kusluch, and this is my colleague, uh, uh, Dr. Detzi or Dan Detzi, depending on how he
Either
wants to be
way,
referred to.
either just Dan, just
Either way
Dan.
is fine. Just Dan. So
Just
today, we're going to start with a discussion about where do we get our foreign policy and international news from. It's a question that a student asked me, and I've been recently teaching about the media and finding reputable sources so we know what's going on in the world. So I thought it would be an interesting opportunity for Dan and I to kind of talk about where we get our news from, what we find trustworthy, so we have a better understanding of what's going on in the world. So, Dan, would you like to start and just kind of talk about like maybe where you like what you like to turn to know what's going on in the world, and then we
yeah,
can open.
yeah, and I've been thinking about this, and maybe I'll put my teacher hat on a bit, but
Yeah,
because we used to teach this back in our old American politics course, because it is difficult, and there's a little bit of generational divide between me and maybe your students who are watching this. So,
yeah,
I, uh, I tend to have a different idea where I get my stuff from that people nowadays that sounds old nowadays. These kids get their news from. But I was also thinking of this analogy because we're just awash with information. I mean, with the
yeah,
internet, with social media, um, and I kind of like if you don't pick and choose where you get your news from to get a good information, then it's kind of like going down the rapids in Grand Canyon with your eyes closed. Just let the rapids take you and hope you don't smash into the rocks or something. Where if you
yeah,
see the expert rafters, they're rowing one way, yelling the other person to dodge the rocks, and they pick the line that they're going to do. So that's kind of how I kind of see picking out news sources to reputable news to listen to. And you're never going to get a news story that isn't framed the way that the reporter wants to frame it.
mhm,
As a consumer of news, you got to be smart. You got to be smart about it. And I just would say to your students, like if you're just looking, scrolling through your social media for news, that's going down the rapids with your eyes closed. You're not going to pick out what's
yeah,
true, what's not. There's a little bit of truth to every story you read, so that's what makes it real confusing. Um, so for me, I go into it knowing that news sources are going to try to frame the story one way or the other. Um, the wrong thing to do is to say, you know what, I'm really pissed off at this administration, so I'm going to watch MS Now. Or those
yeah.
liberal socialists, I'm pissed off at this, so I'm going to watch Fox and get my. That's the wrong thing to do. Someone, a podcast I was listening to put it nicely, where it's basically like, if you want an echo chamber or a mirror of your stuff, if you want a mirror of your own thoughts, this media cycle is like being in a funhouse mirror room. It's all distorted. It's all so yeah. It's definitely don't go to those extremes. Sometimes they'll pick out bits and pieces that you like. So the way I do it is I have basically the standard um, or the traditional news media. Like I'll go to whether it's the New York Times, the Washington
Yeah,
Post, Wall Street Journal. Um, so it's like Wall Street Journal's more right leaning, New York Times more left. Um, and you can kind of see where they lean, but they'll usually have at least uh, the byline's a little bit accurate, right? So like today, while we're recording this, a U.S. airplane was shot down over Iran. So you go to both those sources, the headline's just going to read airplane shot down over Iran. This is what's happening. Here are the facts as we know it. Um, but if you went to like MS Now, it might say, "See, we told you this is going to happen." Or
yeah,
if you go to Fox News, it'd be like, "Oh, our heroes are under duress," and meanwhile the left is berating Trump for having. So yeah, I go to those traditional news sources, even though they lean, but me going down the rapids steering, I know where to go to. So in these highly polarized years that we've been in the United States, I've taken more comfort in when I turn on the TV. Yes, I still turn on the TV for news, but I do it via internet or whatnot. I'll go to BBC News, not BBC
Yeah.
America, but BBC News. So it's the British anchors in Great Britain talking about foreign policy, or because that's really what I look towards for the foreign policy. Because U.S. news sources tend to, unless the United States is doing something in the foreign world, they're not going to report it. They're just not. New York Times still has bureaus across the globe. That's why I kind of go to them a lot too, but BBC does as well. Um, but yeah, BBC will take it from the vantage point of Great Britain, of Europe too. Um, and Joe, I don't want not to step on your toes, but I think we talked about like DW, some of these international,
Yeah.
um, Al Jazeera, which takes like when I'm interested in the Middle East, and they're the ones that, and again, is slanted in one way direction or another. You just have to realize where to steer in the rapids, when you look at the stories. But they do in-depth stories. I also watch like PBS NewsHour, again, a traditional source, used to be the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour. Um, and they do have slants here and there. But what I like about them is they go in depth into the
Yeah.
stories. So they'll take what a standard news station might do, like a network news station might do a 2 minute piece on, they'll do a 15-minute piece and get it from all angles, with different experts that come in and talk about it because it's an hour-long show. Um, I don't tend to really do podcasts except when it's a foreign policy issue. I might go to the Council of Foreign Relations podcast,
Yeah.
um, and some of these think tanks that are like nonpartisan think tanks. They'll take their guests that talk on there will take their slugs at whether it's this administration or the last one. They'll take their swings at it, but um, it's a discussion about an issue. It's not necessarily reporting the news. It's talking about it and analyzing it a bit. So that's basically what I do. I will run the rapids the best I can with my paddle, with my eyes open. But one thing I don't do anymore, and again, this will show my age, but I used on Facebook, I scroll and scroll. I finally just said I can't do it because
Yeah.
it's been shown that social media is addictive, and you just scroll, and the algorithms will give you the angry news. It'll give you the news that will piss you off, and the more you click on it, the more it'll give you this slanted news that's not even close to
Yeah.
uh, reading a paper or listening to a full news story. So that's it. And then one last recommendation to your students before I send it over to you, Joe, is that you have to read. I mean, there's people talking
Yeah.
and that, but there's a reason why literacy the and prosperity are tied together. There's a reason why some governments like the Taliban in Afghanistan or groups like Boko Haram and West Africa forbid reading literacy especially for women, for girls and women, because it means power. It means you understand things. You have information as power. Um, there's a reason why back in the Civil War era and even into the Jim Crow era in the United States, plantation owners pre-war and then southern states post-war would not allow African Americans to become literate. And it was illegal
Yeah.
for slaves to become literate because it means power. So that's why when I had students and they say, "Oh, I hate reading," and I'm like, "Man, people are fighting and dying to be able to learn how to read," and
Yeah.
that's where you're really going to get the good information that you're going to be able to kind of um, ingest yourself and kind of marinate in it. If someone's talking at you, it's hard to do it all the time. And I know for me too, I go to podcasts or to news to kind of hear what other people think. So it gets you multiple sides as well. But traditional print media is whether it's Reuters or AP, like some of these straight down the line,
Yeah.
or at least supposed to be straight down the line, calling balls and strikes on what the news are. You have to read those. And if the article's a page and a half, the article's a page and a half. That probably means it's a good, a thorough article. So we kind of gotten away with that in the social media age and in the smartphone phase. It's something I think
Yeah.
the younger generation now is kind of pushing away from the just this whole digital life and going more towards what they call an analog existence, which I appreciate. So I'm hoping your students are doing that as well. But that's my take. That's my quick
Yeah.
long take.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dan. And so I'll build off a lot of that. So I remember when I was still a PhD student, we had to take this one credit course, just like teaching at university. And the professor that was teaching it sat us down and she's like, it's you versus cat videos. And I may have told you this story before. And when you think about that, like it's you who, like us as PhD students, teaching maybe some dry topics or theory versus entertainment. And it
Mhm.
is hard to win that battle. And I think we see that in the news space, where sometimes reading articles from the Washington Post or the New York Times isn't as enjoyable as maybe listening to entertainment news. And so that is a struggle that I think students and adults are facing, that we've moved away from conventional publications. And so, yeah, that is definitely a struggle. And I think what some people also run into is like I subscribe to the Washington Post and I get a New York Times subscription through UNC, but these publications are behind paywalls, and that can be that's
Mhm.
another issue, that like the good stuff is behind paywalls and the free stuff that and we understand why. Like like we have to pay journalists and we have to run these organizations, but there is this structural problem where like that good news, well, you have to subscribe. The New York Times is kind of expensive, so my students here at UNC all have New York Times subscriptions. At the Air Force Academy, we did, but I do worry that the most accessible things are sometimes not the best. And I don't know how you solve that, but it is a reality that I think.
Yeah. And just an interesting put you said the Air Force Academy of New York Times after the one of the first orders from the Secretary of Defense after he came in was no more New York Times subscriptions for the service academies.
Oh,
So it's
oh,
too much fake news, right? Too much.
okay.
So they were picking and choosing what, the service
Yeah.
academy students could and could not read it. So yeah, it's an interesting world that we live in.
Yeah. And so even so, I'm a subscriber to the Washington Post. I think the Washington Post is a solid publication. I know they've faced a lot of pushback lately because of their downsizing of the Middle East department. And so on Blue Sky, I see people saying, well, you should unsubscribe from the Washington Post, which is fine. We all make decisions on how we spend money. But I do like the Washington Post because you do get two perspectives. If you look at the editorial pages, there are a lot of liberal and conservative voices, and that sometimes frustrates people. But building off what you said, Dan, that does allow an exposure to competing ideas in a way that on social media, with the algorithms like you mentioned, we might not be exposed to that opposite side. And even if we don't agree with it, even if we think the other side of the argument is grotesque or wrong, at least understanding where they're coming from to help build your own argument, to construct your own view of the world, I think is important.
Mhm.
But again, building off what you said, if we enter these silos of information, then you don't even understand the argument that the other side is making. And
Mhm.
then how do you debate ideas if you won't even entertain where the other side's coming from? So
Yeah.
I too, I probably use social media a little bit more than you, Dan, but I agree. My go-to publication is The Economist, the British publication, because for the reasons you gave, it gives long-form news. So it tries to put the news of the day in a broader context of, okay, maybe there's a historical reason why what is happening. And I think because it's a once a week publication, maybe they have a little bit more time to put things
Mhm.
in context than daily publication, which is on um, a much tighter schedule.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, the BBC I think is great. As you mentioned, DW News, Al Jazeera, these international news organizations, um, I think are really good at telling us what's going on in the world in a way that, yeah, if we turn on MSNBC, it's very, very American focused. And like you said, we kind of know what's going on. If
Mhm.
we return on MSNBC now, we kind of know they're going to be criticizing Trump, criticizing the war. Their coverage is going to be extremely focused on the Iran conflict. Uh, and in my opinion, ignoring many of the other things going on in the world,
Yeah.
which are worthy of discussion. We know there are other main conflicts going on in the world that attention just isn't being paid to. So I really like the idea that you brought up of traditional news, but also be looking at a lot of different news sources. So I wrote down a few that you covered. Like I read The Economist, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian from the UK is also free. It's a mainstream newspaper, but it's not behind a paywall. So for students, for people that are concerned about paywalls, The Guardian is a free publication that you can go to their website, you can read the news articles, and um, don't have to pay, which and so something you brought up, and I think is interesting to think about more, is this idea of actually reading the articles. And with social media, we know that people, and we know studies have shown how many people will read a headline, but not the article. And we know there are downsides of that because well, for one, you need to know what's actually in the article, but two, the headline oftentimes doesn't give the full complexity
Mhm.
of the article. So if you're scrolling social media, you'll see these headlines. And using your example of the Iran war right now, you won't know like what's actually going on with just the headlines. So definitely, it would be nice if students or the population in general could just start to read a little bit more because the headlines oftentimes aren't giving the full image of what's going on.
Yeah. And
So I did want to, no, please go.
I was just gonna say again on I mean, there's been studies on, and this is one of the reasons I stopped scrolling social media, especially for news, but for other things too, is that studies have shown that and you probably noticed this as well, that your attention span, the attention span of the average person that uses social media, um, is a lot shorter. And that's on, that's your brain changing. So,
Yeah,
and I noticed this is why I quit too, because I noticed myself when I wanted to read an article, after the first two paragraphs, I get bored and I'd look away or turn. I'm like, this isn't how
yeah,
I used to be. I mean, what's going on here? So, and I did notice the change when I shut it all off and I was reading full articles, that I can actually get through an article again without saying, "Oh, that's boring. What's happening." And it's not us as it's our own physiology that's doing it. But as
yeah,
these court cases about, of Meta being addictive and harmful to, just like smoking, we now have the warning labels on on there. That includes like things like diminished cognitive abilities,
yeah,
attention span, and that matters a lot when you're reading or taking in news. It's the difference between just getting the brief pinhole snapshot or the big picture. And you want to be literate in the news, not just, a victim of what the social media algorithm wants you to see. Yeah, that's my soapbox.
Yeah, and I do think that, and I thought this more probably a decade ago or 5 years ago, but I still feel that it can be useful as a jumping off point to
Mhm.
find news articles. Then you can dig deeper into them. You still have the problems of algorithms feeding us uh, uh, stores to keep us on their website. That's why the
Yeah,
algorithm does what it does. But if we use social media as a jumping off point, so it maybe we're being then exposed to news publications we never thought of before. So I know students because when I ask them like where do you get your news from, it is social media, and some do use it as a jumping off point. So I think that's just a reality of where we are today. But
hmm
then taking that next step, okay, then let's actually read the article and not get bored
yeah. Well,
after.
it takes effort, you know.
Yeah.
It takes effort to do it. Like you said, if you make the decision that's going to be a jumping off point, that's going to be an effort on someone that they really want to know about the story and the information. If you really don't want to know about it, you're just going to scroll past it and think you know
Yeah.
about it, which you really don't, you know? So, um, yeah, like I said, it's like going down those rapids. You got to paddle, you got to work, you got to concentrate.
Yeah.
It takes time. And I think that's why a lot of people just have kind of given up um, and are closing their eyes going down the rapids, plural.
Yeah. And we saw this. I think we first saw this after the 2016 election. This idea of like doom scrolling, where
hmm
people just get sucked in to just scrolling, and then they maybe don't even want to open news articles.
Yeah.
I
Well,
remember I got,
I was gonna say definitely during COVID, you know, that was
yeah,
when people were just had nothing else to do when they're locked in or I mean a lot of people still had to go to work and all that, but yeah, doom scrolling, that's when I first heard about it. I'm sure it happened before then, but um I could see the I could see the downside to it. And that's what I was doing. That's why I shut off my stuff. I'm like, enough doom scrolling.
yeah. Yeah, I definitely pulled back some after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine because I would catch myself just for like an hour doom
hmm
scrolling through Twitter, looking for updates on the war. And I think I was partially in shock because of the full-scale invasion and just wanting news. But then I realized like this isn't for one. I can get this news
Yeah.
from the Washington Post tomorrow morning, and it's not healthy just to be sucked in and traumatized by
hmm
everything that's emerging. But it's
Yeah.
hard. It is hard mentally to move away from that.
Because too, what your mind first goes to, you see, it could be a post on whatever you're on, or it could be a video on TikTok or on YouTube. The first thing you think about is looking at the comments. And then, you know, that's a whole other ball. And that's what people are, you know, they're getting their popcorn, looking at the comments without
Yeah,
really, and the story goes down the drain, and you're in a watching a fist fight in the comments. So yeah, it's a, that's the other draw. And so when you're reading, like when I'm
yeah,
reading an article too, sometimes I wonder what people are commenting on. And sure enough, I can't really scroll down to the bottom to see the comments, so it helps me out. I
yeah.
just focus on the article. And no matter what people say in the comments, it's going to be something really not very profound. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the big takeaway is like because of the media landscape we live in, people will still use social media, but it would be beneficial if we would still read longer form articles, still read newspaper articles that give some context and aren't just knee jerk reactions. And that's tough. But if we want to know more about foreign policy and international relations, it's definitely a something we have to strive to
Yeah.
strive to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, any more thoughts on the media? I will say I do watch a lot of podcasts on YouTube. If I'm like cleaning around the house, I'll have a YouTube podcast on, and we know that these are oftentimes a little bit more partisan than, say, a New York Times article, but still, it's just how we consume news today
Yeah.
seems to.
Yeah, I agree. So, like, I'm gonna end how I started. It's like this is my
Yeah,
point of view. I grew up, I'm Gen Xer, so I grew up in the 80s where um, still had network news. Cable news was just kind of coming online, but was like CNN was the more trusted, like because
yeah,
it was like during the first Gulf War and they were in Baghdad. So it was like, all right, this is much, different. I had the three stations and then the newspapers. And so I'm coming at it from a different viewpoint of, okay, this is what I grew up with.
yeah,
And that's what but now when I watch network news, I'm like, all the stories are just kind of fluff. And it's true that no one watches it anymore. That's
yeah,
a big reason why it's kind of dying, and that's fine. And I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and they give a lot of good information. Like this idea that, well, news is now, I guess it was information to me. News is now, um, even though the Trump administration is really hammering down on the networks and people say, well, there's censorship going on, a lot of people, especially in the podcast world or in YouTube, are saying, well, it doesn't matter because media has moved to the independent realm.
yeah,
And you can't, you know, an administration, whether it's the Trump administration or, a future Democratic administration, you can't go after everyone in every venue. So this
yeah.
independent news and whether it's podcasts or other sources is really what's taken. And your students probably are like, oh, of course, dummy. That's why would you not think that? So, but I am going more towards, more of the streaming stuff, more podcast for deeper information. And
Yeah.
again, like anything else, it's going to be slanted, there's going to be bias. You just have to mentally know and make the note that this is going to be biased this direction. So I should have, and I do when I listen to podcasts, I'm like, well, that was a dumb thing to say. And even though I agree with maybe their slant, I'm like, that's not even close to being true. And no one's there to challenge them sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I find myself talking back at the podcast saying, wait a minute, stop the podcast. That was factually
Yeah.
incorrect.
Yeah, and just the evolution of podcasts,
Yeah.
like whether it's on YouTube or just listening to the audio
Mhm.
podcast, I sometimes listen to the Bulwark, which has an angle. They
Yeah.
have a position, but they bring on like experts, and they've really been hiring more and more experts in the field. They hired Bill Crystal, who at least brings some of that expertise
Yeah.
to, in a way that maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, podcasts looked very different because it's now this challenge to conventional media
Mhm.
where, yeah, it might be a podcast, it might be on YouTube, but hey, we have our own experts. We do have experts here that a decade ago would have been on the nightly news, but now they're finding these new outlets,
Mhm.
really making these new outlets reputable sources of news. These are still experts in their field, and they might bring a perspective. And so maybe that's a problem because their perspectives aren't being challenged if it's three anti-Trumpers or three liberals or three conservatives hanging out.
Mhm.
But we also see that on MS Now or Fox News. So it's these criticisms against podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So that was a nice discussion, Dan. Do you have any concluding remarks or?
Hmm. No, I think I've said my piece. Sure.
Excellent, my friends.
It's
Awesome.
like,
So thank you so much, Dan, for the
mhm.
discussion about media and where we can trustfully find news about what's going on in the world. So thank you.
Thanks.